Hey, welcome to another installment of Just Weebs. I'm Onimaru and I'm here with Shocking, and today we have two awesome guests that we've brought over. Bryce, you want to say hi?
Hey. Thank you for having me on.
I should have said a little more about Bryce. So Bryce is my friend in real life. I brought him on for today's topic, but we've also brought on our friend here, Carter, from he's a minor celebrity on Twitter. Carter, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Carter. Minor celebrity might be a little bit too presumptuous, but hardcore RWBY fan for better and for worse. Hyperfixation. That's why I'm here. I'm here to talk about RWBY and give everyone an understanding of what they might not know.
Yeah. So now Carter kind of gave it away. We are talking about RWBY. That is why we brought them on, because Shaw and I recently said, she had like a conversation on Twitter with Carter about RWBY and specifically Dead Fantasy, and then we were like, we should do a pod on it. But unfortunately, we're not the qualified ones here, so we were like, we need to bring on people that would be qualified enough to broach this topic with us, and that's why I thought bring Bryce on and bring Carter on. And the reason we're talking about RWBY is because if you don't know already, it recently got announced that it got an anime adaptation, or is getting an anime adaptation in the form of RWBY Ice Queendom, and it's gotten a little bit of buzz because it has some legit like big names attached to it, like Studio Shaft is doing it. Gen Urobuchi, who's known for Madoka, Fate Zero, he's like attached to at least being the original anime like concept for the story. And I think the original character designs are done by Hugh, who's known for all the Steins Gate like original character designs. So that's some pretty big names, and it has a fully star-studded cast of voice actors. So that's like, okay, this is a legit anime. Unfortunately, the trailer dropped and we kind of watched it, got a little tidbit of it, and it's not looking good, especially for a studio like Shaft that's known for Monogatari and highly stylized, super stylish, peak cinematography series. I don't know what they did with this one. So, it's not looking too great. What about you guys? Did you guys get to check it out, Bryce, Carter?
Yeah, I saw some of the trailer, and I wasn't overly excited. I was more like, it's there. That's happening. That was my take on it.
What about you, Carter?
I had watched it when I had seen the first promotional material that had come out. The image that was just like Project RWBY at the time, and it was that image of Weiss in that Esdeath looking outfit behind all the mechs and whatnot. I saw it when it came out, was very interested. I kind of thought it was going to be along the lines of that Star Wars anime like anthology series that they did on Disney Plus when I first heard about it. But as we got closer to the official announcement, I saw that they were going to have those new outfits and whatnot, and I was like, oh, this is going to be like a completely new story that's really interesting and cool. Especially considering the fact that a lot of what ends up happening in the side material for RWBY focuses on just like the Beacon days and like volume 1 to volume 3. So I was very excited for a new take on this. And then I saw the trailer, and the trailer was just everything that I've seen before in multiple different mediums, and got a little bit disappointed. Especially hearing the fact that it was Shaft and Gen Urobuchi was going to be on it as well. I've watched it a couple of more times since then just to kind of get a better understanding of what it might be. And I also read the same post that you did from Rooster Teeth themselves explaining it. So I'm in a state of cautious optimism with it. I think that's the best way to go into it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I saw the trailer, and, first I saw the big names attached, Shaft, obviously known for Monogatari and a bunch of other big productions. So they're a named, big name studio. Gen Urobuchi, who did Madoka and Fate Zero, he's attached to it as like the original animation concept. At least his name's attached. That means a lot, since he hasn't really been active in anime for the past few years. And even the Hugh did the original character designs. He's like known as the character designer for Steins Gate. He did most of the Steins Gate character designs. I'm like, okay, this is a big deal. And then I saw the trailer, and I'm just like, this looks like a fuck you production. This is not the level I expected it. It doesn't look good. And I think I think a lot of people shared that same sentiment, and it sort of buried itself and became irrelevant right after people saw the trailer and were like, okay, skip. So I don't know. Like, I'm glad it's getting an anime. But I'm not sure if we can, like it'll be like a checkbox, like, but it won't really mean much, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that Shaft was the one to do this, I feel like. I'm not super into like the behind the scenes development and like understanding of like how studios function and how they work. I just kind of have the general basis just from the circles that I'm in and getting an understanding of it. And as a follower of Shaft, because I'm a huge Monogatari fan, I know that a lot of their major talent had left to other studios by this point. And for the past couple of years, outside of the Madoka movie that they're making, they've kind of been putting out a lot of like C-list sort of stuff, kind of like very middle of the road. You kind of watch it, and then you're like, oh yeah, Shaft was the one that made that. When I was watching the trailer, the vibes that I actually got from it were Assault Lily Bouquet, which is like the last Shaft anime I watched, and I only watched like the first couple of episodes and kind of fell off. And it was funny because when I was watching it, I was kind of like, this reminds me of RWBY a little bit. So it's interesting that they're the ones taking it, especially considering that aside from like their major films, it's not like they've ever been really known for their like high, like, how do I put this? Dealing with like very action oriented series.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really, they've had action scenes in some of their shows, but they're not really known for that. So that could be part of it. But even in I don't know. Again, just basing this off the trailer, even from the scenes that weren't action heavy, it didn't seem like a top tier production. It didn't seem like the characters moved smoothly. It was just kind of little weird looking. But besides the anime adaptation, I think maybe now it kind of has its anime cred. But what do you guys think of RWBY as a series, like the original RWBY? What do you think of it? Whoever wants to go first.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah.
we can unload it a little bit.
I'll go first so it can work up to our more experienced people. Okay, so I mean, I heard about RWBY from other anime people, other anime fans who had mentioned it, and then they brought up how like Monty Oum had created it, and I knew about Dead Fantasy somehow like separate, and I was like, oh, like that sounds really cool, and it's gained a lot of popularity in the West. So I checked out season 1, and I thought it was pretty cool. I liked it, and you could tell that it really had his passion for very intricate, very distinctive fight choreography. I feel like that's like a big thing with RWBY. I know we can get into this later. I feel like it might be controversial to be talking about like, does RWBY look good? I will get into that later because I feel like that's kind of an interesting talking point. But no matter what, I think no one can deny that it has like very detailed, intricate fight choreography that obviously pulls from a lot of different genres, like action movies, video games, whatever. So like his passion for spectacle, I think, was really there. And I found the setting and characters pretty fun. I'm just like a sucker for like, oh, we have different fighting powers and we're in a cool setting and like we're fighting different guys in cool ways, whatever. It's like, it's fun stuff. So I started season 2 and I didn't finish it, not because of any fault of RWBY. I just kind of fell off of it, but I think it's a fun series. I didn't get deep into the lore like I think you guys did, or deep into following it. So I'm excited to hear what more there is to it, but definitely me not following it is not like against RWBY. Just sometimes you kind of lose track of things, and that's the camp I'm in.
Yeah, and RWBY definitely, to take it even back a bit, its chronology, its history is really like, its claim to fame was really, it was tied to Monty Oum and his, again, like you said, his passion for fight choreography and all of that. That's what really put RWBY, I wouldn't say on the map, because people already knew he was attached to it, and that's why they were excited for it. But that's what he was known for. By when he started out was with his original short called Haloid, and that was, he did a CGI fight sequence between Samus Aran from Metroid versus Master Chief from Halo, and he had reversed engineered the models from Halo 2 and Super Smash Bros. Melee and kind of took those models and ran with it and made this whole awesome fight scene that back in the day, back in those YouTube days, that went viral and, that spread. And then in 2007, then he made the series that you all love, Dead Fantasy, which he did like 7 shorts, which was Dead or Alive characters versus Final Fantasy characters, focusing on different ones for each short. But yeah, it was all just action, and he did 7 of them, and number 8 remained incomplete. He did a preview for it in like 2011, and that was it. He got fed up with the fans asking him for more, as Bryce knows. And then after that, he got focused on RWBY because he had already started working for Rooster Teeth in 2010, doing Red versus Blue. They brought him on to do that, and then they gave him his own show, and that was RWBY. And then he started doing that. So people were already having that expectation, especially because the RWBY trailers that came out before the show were very, very like very impressive and brought a lot of hype because they were a lot closer to what Monty Oum is known for in his flashy spectacle, action sequences with all weapons that double up as guns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta love that though.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah. And I actually got to give credit where credit's due. The person that actually introduced me to Dead Fantasy and Monty Oum as a person is actually right here, is Bryce. He was the guy on the first day of Anime Club with a laptop in like 2009, and he's just playing Dead Fantasy on his laptop.
Oh my God.
And showing everybody. And then we're all crowding around his laptop and being like, oh, what is that? And then he was telling me all about it. So
Yeah, man. That was a long time ago. Jesus. Business out there. Watching Dead Fantasy, it's was part of reasons why I was very hyped for RWBY, and I think I stuck through RWBY. I've watched every volume for a long time, so I've seen it at its best, seen it at its worst, seen it at its its lull. So it's you gotta keep going with it sometimes, like, because it starts off like a typical story, like, okay, you get introduced to these characters and everything like that, seasons 1 and 2, and then I think season 3 is where, volume. I keep saying season. I'm already speaking like it's an anime or something like that. But, but I think by like volume 3, that's when everything really starts turning around and like, okay, they're not like, it's like, oh, there's a greater thing going on rather than just a bunch of kids fighting monsters and everything like that. So then you get to volume 4, volume 5. I think volume 6 had like my favorite episode, the Lost Fable. Super lore heavy, and I love that so much. I'm in it just to see the end of it. I'm in it to see the end of it. I'm sticking through it, and it's like I just need to see how it ends, how they're gonna do it, how they're gonna finish it, because it does have some glaring issues. And then, of course, the long wait for episodes or between volumes can be taxing at times.
Yeah. So it was funny because I was rewatching Dead Fantasy today in preparation for this. And there was one thought that came to mind when I was watching it. And the best way I can describe Dead Fantasy to anyone who ever wants to get into it, it's JRPG anime Fantasia.
Yeah.
That is all it is. It is all about the music, it's all about the visuals, it's all about the spectacle. And when they come together and combine, they make something really, really cool. I made a tweet about it right before I got on, basically calling it raw culture, because that's exactly what it is. And that was the appeal of early RWBY going into it. It was the idea that you were going to have this spectacle combining with this original music from Jeff and Casey Williams. And the early portions of the show are very much like, they're very much your typical kind of fighting school anime. And then as you get further and further on through the show, I think the best way I can also describe it is it's the most unabashed shonen you're ever going to watch without ever wanting to commit to being called a shonen. And it's funny because the fan base doesn't like calling it a shonen whatsoever. They do not like it. They don't like
That's
the
how you know it's
comparison.
the shonen fan base. If they don't want to be called shonen fan base.
See, I've been waiting for people to start coming around and calling it a seinen in turn, but it's not that. The show, the tone of the show takes a very sudden shift in volume 3 and starts focusing on the grander aspects of the world of Remnant at large, for better and for worse. And this is when the show, I think, kind of starts running into some of its biggest issues, because a lot of this show, I think, was developed for people our age at the time when we were younger. And, you know, we were just kind of like, whoa, what's this cool, like, anime looking thing that's like on the internet? I want to watch it. That seems cool. And then as its audience has grown up, I think they've wanted to tell stories that are for an older audience that deal with more mature themes, but it's never really gotten to the point where they've really allowed themselves to indulge in that. There's always been kind of like a PG-13 sort of rating with it, and PG-13 isn't bad whatsoever. You can tell amazing stories in PG-13, but I think a lot of what the show wants to do is really hampered by how much they have to tailor it toward a younger audience, in my opinion.
Okay.
I never thought of it that way. It's a good take.
I mean, you know, I think about it a lot just because, again, hyperfixation. But I think about it a lot, and I think about a lot of what the show wants to tackle, and there's some very, like, heavy themes that the show dives into. Racism, classism, just like general, like, a generational divide and whatnot, abuse. Like, it gets very heavy at certain points, but it's always coated in a layer of, like, we can't let it go too far. We can't let it get too real, because if it gets too real, we start isolating people. And I've always felt that's been the biggest thing that holds it back from ever really getting to the point that it really wants to get at. So that's really where my opinion on that comes from.
I'm kind of curious because I feel like I'm not really super deep into like what Rooster Teeth has done, but you mentioned like where they want to get it to. Like, do you think they want this to be kind of like considered like a legitimate like anime show on the same lines? And I'm not saying it's not a legitimate show or not like legitimate anime, but I'm thinking like, are they trying to go for something like Arcane? And they're not quite getting Arcane. And I mean, that is like an animated TV show that a lot of people consider legitimate, and they're just like not quite getting there. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. The important thing to remember is that Rooster Teeth is actually owned by Warner Media at this point.
Gotcha.
So they're underneath this subsection of like a broader, grander, like just general media hub. For those that don't know, Rooster Teeth has partnered with DC Comics to do comic book adaptations of RWBY. And so far they've done 2 of them. They did one that took place in volume 4 and in between volume 4 and volume 5, which kind of filled in the gaps of like some stuff that was left out. And then the second thing they did was a crossover comic with the Justice League. And it was like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and the rest of the Justice League in the world of Remnant, basically teaming up with RWBY to fight Starro the Conqueror. So,
Wait, what?
Yeah.
I didn't even know that existed.
It's so outlandish. Wait.
The RWBY rabbit hole goes deep. It goes deep.
Can Starro even control a Grimm? I'm so confused. I have so many questions.
It's like Grim Starro. It's like a Grim version of Starro the Conqueror.
Oh, okay. That's terrifying, actually.
It is. So RWBY's been underneath this Warner Media branch for a while now, and it's weird because I only recently had to kind of come to grips with the idea that it's an IP now. Sounds very weird to say, but I was on Twitter yesterday or whatever, and Warner Media on their Twitter account, I don't know why anyone would be following it, was doing some March Madness bracket where they were like, vote for your favorite characters in this like March Madness style bracket to see who wins. And like, you know, it had like a bunch of like, you know, people that were like on there, like Bugs Bunny, Harley Quinn, probably a character from The Sopranos, I don't know. But Yang Xiaolong was on that bracket, and Yang won the entire bracket. She beat out Harley Quinn. She beat out Bugs Bunny. Like, it's crazy, but it made me come to the realization really quick that, like, RWBY's an IP. They're doing these cringy brand crossovers with, like, everything else, and it's an IP, and they really want to push it up to this level, because anime is becoming such a mainstay in Western culture. And I think the Arcane comparison is definitely apt. I think that's kind of what they're striving for, and I think there's a certain legitimacy that they're trying to aim with it, especially in the overseas market too. Because if you take a look at the Japanese dub of the series, there's some amazing talent working on it for the voices.
Yeah.
Like, it is completely star-studded from top to bottom, and it's just crazy, you know?
Yeah. And I was talking about it with Bryce before this, and he was reminding me that RWBY's like on HBO Max, and I was like, oh, that's right. Like, that's so, like, it was so, like, I knew it, but like kind of putting it together was just so jarring in my mind, just being on there. I'm like, oh, okay. But then the other comparison with Arcane is also kind of crazy, because I feel like for me, when I was keeping track of RWBY, I dropped off like volume 5, like somewhere, I think at the end of volume 5, and then I just kind of, same reason, sort of like forgot, lost interest, whatever. But like, what RWBY has always felt like this sort of like, I'd like to say like Pinocchio story, where it's like, it's not a real anime, but it is a real anime, or it's trying to be. And like with like everything, as the more it progressed, like the fans would kind of like either get their hopes up or like cheer for it, like, oh, now it's not 5-minute episodes, now it's 15-minute episodes, now it's 20-minute episodes. Like, it's kind of now feeling more like an anime. Oh, it's, the animation's getting better, like, or they're improving, and it's like they're getting like step by step closer and closer to, being like the real thing. That's kind of how it always sort of felt. But then it's also kind of crazy to see that like it's still like everyone. And I was looking at some like recent like reviews and kind of to see where the consensus is now on the latest seasons. And there's a lot of disappointment, because what everyone saw from the beginning and still sees now is that there's all this potential in RWBY, but it still hasn't reached it yet. And it's crazy to think like it's not even, now that Arcane has come out, it's not even like the 3D that's holding it back, because like Arcane, which is 3D, like does it so well. It's so like masterful, like it's so good. And now it's like you have this thing that exists that's just pretty much is the epitome of what RWBY's been trying to do this whole time. And I'm not saying RWBY can't still get there, but it's just insane now, like, like kind of that they still haven't reached it.
So I guess like, I don't know if we're planning on getting into spoilers too much, but like I imagine the people who are watching this who are watching our podcast now have seen RWBY more than I have. Are you guys able to be kind of like specific about what you feel is disappointing? And this will count as the like spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled, don't listen to the segment.
And I can kind of, as someone that doesn't know, like I can actually think, I can pinpoint what it is from what I heard. It has to do with the storytelling. It's like people accuse it of bad writing. I like bad pacing, bad writing, and being like overly reliant on a formula where they kind of do the same things to either pad things out or sort of just, keep the status quo or whatever. But I guess I could see how this is hard to like keep alluding to it without getting very specific on examples.
Because I know about like, I think one big spoiler that I could definitely see, like I heard about this. I'm like, oh, okay, like shit's getting real. Like this is an indicator that shit's getting real. And it's probably like the one character death that I think everyone knows about. Like that one, like, with little I know, I heard that and I was like, oh, I could see they're like ramping up. They're trying to say like people die, consequences happen. We're not a silly shonen where they come back to life. It's just when people die when they're killed. So
all right, here it is. Shit's getting real. Spoilers. So now we can get into it.
Yeah.
So whatever you guys have to say about that one.
I mean, what do you want to know?
Yeah. What do you want to know?
What do you want to know? I mean, you flat out say it. Yeah, that person dies. I mean, but sometimes it's more like you can anticipate a character's going to die. Like it's not the one death in season. Was it volume 2 is when Can we say names now?
Volume-
Yeah.
Pirate,
Volume
yeah.
3.
It was 3 when Pyrrha died.
Oh, yeah, 3.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could kind of tell that it was the signs were there, like if either she was going to die or be incapacitated for a long time, and because her opponent was Cinder, and Cinder had good control over her maiden abilities, and Pyrrha had magnetism. So I was like, okay, well, are they going to actually kill a character? And they did. So that was really shocking. I was like, oh, okay, wow, that happened.
To fill in the blanks, just fill in the blanks real quick. The maidens are basically female magic users within the setting of the show. If I had to simplify it as easy as possible, they are the Avatar, but for different seasons.
Oh, cool. That's a cool power.
That's a good way of putting it.
Nice.
Perfect. Apt.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just
No, you're right.
That's a good way of putting it.
I gotta remember that you have to explain certain things, as I already know.
You're fine. I could follow along, but I do appreciate that because that's that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
So to get it so the maidens have magic, but everyone else is not normal. Like they still have aura and their other special abilities with their semblances, but the difference between a magic user and someone does aura is few and it's huge. It's huge in terms of ability. Yeah. So Pyrrha dies. RWBY does her thing with her with the light, which is revealed later on. She has silver eyes. They alluded to that in the story, and so there's always tidbits of it's tantalizing. You're like, oh wow, this is oh, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about that. And then you get the information wow, that really works. And then you just have how the story progresses. And it's just oh, well, there you go.
That for further explanation as well, the Silver-Eyed powers, if I had to describe them, are kind of just the Mangekyo Sharingan, but they're laser beams that only work on Grimm.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Okay.
So to go into a little bit more deeper portions of it, talking about character deaths, volume 3 is when the show really shifts its tone.
Yeah.
For the last half of the season, it takes a really dark twist where the heroes basically lose. And it's a really cool thing to watch play out, and some really big characters end up dying. Pyrrha is the big one that everyone talks about because that was the one that had the most emotional weight and impact behind it. But it actually kicks off with the death of Penny, the robot character from the first couple of seasons. And it actually comes because one of the characters used an illusion on Pyrrha to make it look like Penny was going to attack her with basically Gilgamesh's Gates of Babylon. And she ended up using her magnetism powers so hard to stop all of them that she basically cut Penny in half.
Oh, wow.
It was pretty brutal, but that was the thing that set everything off into motion.
Yeah.
And then immediately after that as well, fan favorite villain Roman ended up dying. He ended up dying in this battle with RWBY on top of the airship, and basically he was beating down on RWBY, and he was giving his whole monologue about how him doing what he was doing is all about survival because the world's just so much more dangerous now, only for him to get eaten alive by a Grimm. It's really, really cool. There's this real sense of stakes and oh, they're really going to commit to this. Mm-hmm. And then 4 years down the line, Penny comes back to life.
There it is.
Now, I know the big thing that probably people listening to this are probably going to say is, well, she was a robot. That doesn't matter. Robots come back to life all the time. The big thing that kind of ended up hurting that reveal is twofold. One, takes away the stakes from previous stuff. It shows that characters can come back to life regardless if they're a robot or not. And two, she came back to life without any real consequence to it. One of the big things that they show is that Penny's robotic nature is functioned by aura. Basically, she is soul powered. And the idea is that if you kill the soul, you shouldn't be able to just come back to life the same as normal.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people were expecting that if Penny came back to life, she wouldn't remember RWBY or anyone else. She wouldn't even be acting like herself because she'd be an entirely different person.
Yeah, that was the big thing. Yeah.
It was. And it kind of play up this little like Ship of Theseus parallel thing that they were building toward her character with. And when she comes back, she remembers everyone, and everyone kind of just treats it as like, oh wow, Penny's back. Hi, Penny.
Yeah.
And then that's it.
Yeah.
And that was one of the, that wasn't the first moment that like really hit me as like, oh, this is what this story is going to be about.
Yeah, it was definitely a drop of the ball on a story thread that they could have used. That would have been very interesting to see play out, and that Penny would be different. But I think part of that is because RWBY is like a retelling of a bunch of different fairy tales. So like Penny's character is basically the story of Pinocchio. So I think that's partially why they lean towards having her remember everything, even though if you want to do it from a good story standpoint, it's like, okay, we can use the robot angle and say, well, it's Penny, but it's not the same Penny. And that would have been definitely a better way of doing it for a story. And then maybe even like, oh, through, random trope, anime trope, oh, through the power of friendship, she gets her memories back or something like that. They could have done that, but maybe they decided not to. Who knows on that point.
The weird thing, because I totally agree with that. I 100% see what you're saying, especially considering how her arc ends up playing out.
Yeah.
It's weird because every character in RWBY is based off of some kind of like fairy tale or like myth or whatever. And they very much pick and choose which ones they want to adapt super faithfully.
Yep.
Some of them are very much just a total like aesthetic thing, like RWBY being Little Red Riding Hood. It is just the red hood. That is it. There's nothing else to it.
Nothing.
There's nothing else to it. But then you have Penny, and then you also have Cinder, who Cinder is based off of Cinderella, and Cinder's entire backstory is just Cinderella word for word. Penny's entire character arc is Pinocchio word for word. And that's also part of what I think ends up hurting a lot of the perception of the show for a lot of people, especially once you get really deep into it, because usually you keep in the back of your mind like, oh, so this character is based off of Cinderella. What does that mean? How does that play into her character arc? Only for you to then see it plays into her character arc by the fact that she was raised by an evil stepmother. She had two evil stepsisters. She was abused. And then her fairy godmother came along and gave her magical powers to free herself from there. And that ends up being a little bit of a disappointment because you're like, oh, I was really like invested in this character, but she's just Cinderella, but evil.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why a lot of people don't, other than Cinder being Cinder, because she's such a bad villain, but not the type of bad in a good way. She's just a bad villain. Like her motivation is just like, I just want power. That's it. And it's just like, well, power for what? No, I just want power. Well, that's okay, but
cool.
What for what? So it's like you'll do all these horrible things. She doesn't really see anyone as a real comrade at all. They're just like means to an end. And it's just like, it's like a weird insecurity thing she has, I guess, but it doesn't come off as something you can be sympathetic with. She's just a jerk.
That's the best way of putting it.
It sounds like the show doesn't flesh out the characters enough.
I mean, well, I would say that's one of the things. Like, I guess a character who gets some love, who gets a little more, is Crow. Crow is he's a fan favorite character, and I believe it was in the between volume 7 and 8 that you got a little bit more more interesting information from Crow, especially with how he feels about his semblance and how he feels about being around everyone. And for people who don't know, semblance is basically like the RWBY superpower that like each individual person has, like their own semblance, and it's unique to them. And so Crow's semblance is bad luck, right? But he meets another person named Clover, whose semblance is good luck. So they kind of balance each other out. But it kind of alludes to that Crow's semblance is bad luck because he believes it's bad luck. So it's more of a causality thing. If he believes he's good luck, it'll come off as good luck. But if he believes he's a bad person and then all he does is affect bad luck, then it's going to come off as bad luck. So, and it's one of those things where it's not a semblance he can shut off or control. He can't aim it. It's just always on. So you get to see, it's one of the reasons why Crow drinks so much, because he always thinks he's always going to hurt people around him. And so it gives you a deeper, insight to his character, which is really good. And I think another character that they flush out a little bit more is actually the big bad Salem. You actually see stuff about her. They dedicated a whole episode to her and Ozpin, and revealing to you the story of Remnant and all that. And you really get to see like her whole story is that she's just been alone for so long, and she's basically cursed, And her whole reasoning for doing all that she does is basically like to end her curse. And that's really interesting. And I think that's a real interesting take on her character, because you can kind of feel sympathy for her, which they do well with Salem, but they fail with Cinder.
Yeah. And for context, Shaw, Salem is the big bad of
I figured.
She's basically the Wicked Witch of the West. That's her character, because Ozpin is basically the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
She's the Ozai to Cinder's Azula.
But then it's like, it's funny because then in like Avatar, most of the time I feel like people like Azula more than Ozai, but this sounds like the opposite.
The other way around.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Cinder's the Lancer to Salem. Everything. It's really interesting though how we talk about all these side characters and we don't really bring up the main characters all that much. And part of the reason why we don't is because as the show has gotten further along, the main characters have all kind of blended together into one like hive mind.
Yeah.
To the show's detriment. And it really sucks because the four main characters all have very distinct personalities, very distinct characteristics, very distinct backstories. And they never really let the Team RWBY be the focus. And it kind of stinks because when you end up falling for these characters, which is very easy to do, you want to see their stories play out. You want to see them develop. You want to see them go to their logical extremes. I'm wearing a bunch of Yang stuff right now. Yang is like my favorite character in this entire series. I love her to pieces. I think that she could have been the most interesting character in the series because there is a lot, her story is a lot about identity. It's a lot about just like mental health, coping with loss, and being just a better person to watch over those you love. Yeah. And I think it's a very like personal and deep story that deserves a lot of introspection, especially considering the fact that when you take a look at her semblance and how that plays into her character, there's the idea of like, I'll take a beating, but I will get back up and I will get stronger from it. It's powerful. It's really great stuff. But they kind of sidestep away from that to focus on other things because the plot always has to take precedent over the characters.
Yeah.
And that ends up being a really like big sour note for me because like I said, these characters are very easy to fall in love with. They're very easy to get an understanding of and to really like latch on to. So when you don't feel like they're getting the attention they deserve, it ends up really weighing on you while you watch because you're following just a bunch of other characters who are just there to push the plot along and don't really have anything all that interesting to them, or it's something that you've maybe seen like a bunch of times before, and you're just kind of going through the motions waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah,
that's tough.
And it's funny because I asked Bryce yesterday, I was like, hey, how do you, because he was like telling me all about the backstory and his, favorite parts about RWBY and Salem and all of that. And I was like, okay, well, how do you actually feel about the main characters though, since it's their story? And he's like, oh, they're insufferable. And that was it. And I
Yeah.
was like, wait, but they're the leads. Like, yeah, but I don't care about them.
They don't like, yeah. I mean, to be honest, like they don't. I think the only character who actually does any real character like changing in terms of an arc is Yang, who actually has like an arc of her character. Like they spend a couple of volumes on her changing and growing, but RWBY is still RWBY. She's almost exactly the same as she was when it started. Weiss has kind of changed a little bit, and Blake basically resolved some family issues that was going on, and but her character, I mean, for me anyway, and this is my own personal opinion, and like they really haven't like done anything that would change the story in terms of for them growing, which they should though, because if you think about all the stuff they go through, they're basically kids. They're kids.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even like 1 year out of school. Their school got destroyed before they could even get more training, and then they're fighting people. They're not fighting like half-trained hunters or huntresses. They're fighting fully trained people who they were trying to also become fully trained. And that's one of the things where I look at the story and I'm just like, well, there's no way they should be able to beat this person up. Like that doesn't make any sense. But they find a way to beat them up, and that's that's an anime trope, of course. You're the main characters. Your team's name is the name of the show, so it's you're never gonna lose. And that's one of the things with stakes on characters. Like, well, like when they chopped off Yang's arm at the end of Volume 3, I'm like, wow, that was huge. Like, oh my god, they chopped her arm off, and then you remember, oh wait, they kind of revealed that Ironwood is actually the headmaster of another school, because there's basically like 4 schools where they all train, where you train hunters and huntresses at the different countries in Remnant. And in his fighting in Volume 3, you find out that Ironwood has basically half his body, well, not half, but his upper torso, I think on his right side, is almost completely machine, because his character is basically based off the Tin Man.
Mm.
So it's like, oh, what? So Yang's gonna get a metal arm. That's basically where I jumped to when I go, oh, okay, she's gonna get a metal arm. But the journey she goes through from the trauma from the guy who cut her arm off, which was Adam, who's an acquaintance of Blake, was really interesting storytelling. The healing process she had to go through, and then when she actually comes face to face with Adam, you can see her battling the demons of trying to overcome the fear of what he did to her. So it was really interesting seeing that happen and how that played out. Other than that, every other character's been kind of for the main 3 for me, for the main 4 for me.
It's funny the way you were talking about how like they're going and fighting all these like higher level people now. The way I think of it, it's like that it's like that one meme about JRPGs where it's like chapter 1, save the cat from the tree. Chapter 15, fight God. That's where they're at right now.
Yeah.
So I have to agree though that the main team is kind of insufferable right now. RWBY's a static character that doesn't really inflict change on anyone. Blake has kind of been spinning her wheels in the same character arc for a while. And then Weiss is kind of interesting because if you ask most of the fandom, they probably say that Weiss is their favorite character because she's the one that goes through the clearest development. But her development is more so in Volume 1, she's a bratty, whiny, racist, silver spoon in her mouth kind of girl who thinks the world should be at her beck and call until she gets called out, until the writers realize we can't have one of our main leads be racist, and they just kind of sidestep away from that.
Yeah.
And then her character arc then at that point is, I grew up in this family that was very cold, with this kind of semi-abusive father, and it's one of those character arcs that if you've seen like these kinds of shows before, you know exactly what she is, what she's about. I'm a huge Persona fan. She's Diet Mitsuru. That's really what her character is. And it stinks because you go to these really interesting locations and worlds. And he's talking about Ironwood. the headmaster, the kingdom that he's headmaster for, is called Atlas. Atlas is essentially this combination of like Midgar and the floating city from Alita Battle Angel. And it's really fascinating and interesting because that's when you start getting into the classism and whatnot, and you start getting into this idea of like, what would you do to protect what you care about with Ironwood? And it's a really fascinating kind of like twist on what happens with him, and it goes into this kind of like villainous turn for him that you get, albeit it's a little bit rushed. And the thing is, a lot of that villainous turn was because of actions that the main characters took in leaving Ironwood out of the loop, not telling him the truth, hiding information from him, going behind his back and doing other things for no real reason. And then when basically everything hits the fan, they then kind of get angry that Ironwood turned on them. And you end up kind of and they have this very like unearned air of like confidence to them. There's this scene in Volume 7 where Team RWBY's fighting basically like the strongest people in like Atlas's military, and they say something to RWBY along the lines of like, "Give it up, you can't beat us. Like you guys aren't the strong. We're the strongest." And then RWBY says something along the lines in like this really smug, unearned voice of like, "You were the strongest, then you trained us." And like I was like, it like hurt hearing that, because I was like, bro, you've been training with them for like 5 minutes, man. Like he's up.
It was when they faced the Aesops, that was a whole, oh my goodness. And it's more or less the whole thing, like they go more into it, and like in Volume 8, it's like the Aesops aren't really like friends, they're more like co-workers, but even though they are friends. And it was because of like how RWBY's team trusts each other to do things that they ended up coming up on top in that contest. And it was one of those things. It's just like, okay, they have to give them this liberty to win this fight because of the plot. Because if they get beat and get captured, well, that's it. Then you go to the next thing. So they had to do that because basically, I would say RWBY's characters are like agents of chaos. Like Team RWBY are agents of chaos. Agents of chaos. Everywhere they go, something like either blows up or something goes wrong, or they have a plan in place. Like the adults have a plan in place, and I think that's an interesting way for the story to go. It's like, oh wait, that's right, they're still teenagers. So, like, I think Ren, who's a member of Team Juniper, who was member of Pyrrha's team and everything like that.
I remember them.
Yeah, he has in Volume 8, he gets into an argument with Jean and Yang, and he basically like has a realization like, hey man, we're a little bit over our heads in this. We're kids. Like none of us are fully trained. He looks at Jean like, you lied about getting into our school.
Yeah, I remember.
It was like a whole thing, and it's like, you know what? He has a point. Like they're all kids, and they know a bunch of stuff about the world that the adults don't even know. Like, how are you supposed to stop an evil witch who controls all the monsters in the world when she can't die? Like, that's one of the bigger things that they reveal in RWBY and the Lost Fable, that Salem, the big bad, cannot be killed in no way, shape, or form. They cannot be it. And you realize just how serious that is that they blow her up where nothing is left of her, and she reforms from the smoke. So it was like, oh wow, yeah, that's actually very terrifying when you can't actually kill the person. Well, kill or stop. I think that's one of the things that in the future they're going to be leaning towards to RWBY, and the ending of that story with her. It's like they're either going to have to either seal Salem away or find a way to heal her from what made her the way she is. Because that's the only way to stop her, because she's actually immortal, not retroactively immortal. She's literally cannot be killed.
And she's one of the only few, or one of 2 people that has actual magic versus everybody else that doesn't.
Exactly.
So
like the 4 maidens have magic, but that magic came from Osmond.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
So
that brings up an interesting point of like, you're mentioning like, oh yeah, that dude has a point. Like does the story kind of treat it as if like, oh, like all these people have different perspectives because of the events that transpired? We're gonna like let you kind of make your own decision on who has a point, or are they kind of like, nah, that guy's silly, like we're taking down the big bad kind of thing?
The show wants you to believe that everyone's point is kind of like valid. Volume 8
Yeah.
is very much about that, because I
Mhm.
think like the opening song even says something like everyone's the hero of their own story or something in the
Mhm.
Yeah.
lyrics. But it's very clear whose opinion is right and whose opinion is wrong. And
Yeah.
it's Team RWBY's opinion who's right and everyone else who's wrong.
Mhm.
And I really like the Agent of Chaos point that you brought up, because I love those kinds of stories. I'm a huge One Piece fan, and One Piece is literally the definition of we are agents of chaos wherever we go. Something's going to go down the second we get
Pirates, man.
here. Something is going to go down the second
Yeah.
we get here. But it's always portrayed in a way that kind of pushes the characters forward and forces everyone else to kind of reevaluate everything about them and what's around them. Team RWBY doesn't really ever get that benefit. It's usually we mess things up, and we mess things up because we think we know better than everyone else.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that gets really infuriating.
Yeah. It's basically being a bratty teenager and thinking you're right and you know better than everybody else. But they are bratty teenagers. They are teenagers.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. But I think Atlas Volume 8 in Atlas Volume 7 and 8 gave us a real interesting idea on the perspective, like you were saying, like, because you get to see the haves, the have-nots, then you get to see the military, how they view things, and then when everything's going down, when there's a massive Grim invasion, you get to see how Atlas is prioritizing different things in terms of what they need to do. And of course, at this point, Ironwood's character has done a complete 180. He's gone from being the protector of trying to protect everybody and trying to bring people together to just being like, Atlas is the most important. Atlas must survive. If Atlas doesn't survive, the world is doomed anyway. So it's one of the things that you see what's his driving force of his character. And then there was like I think there was like rumors or story or things in story that he was acting this way because of his semblance. But I don't think they ever really revealed in the show what his semblance was, or if his semblance was even active. So I was really confused about that.
His semblance, I forgot the name of it exactly, but essentially it's like a hyper focus sort of thing where it's like once he sets his mind to something, he only like focuses on that kind of thing to the detriment of everything else. And you're right, they never did bring it up in the show. The only time the semblance has ever been mentioned was in a Q&A panel at a convention where they purposely brought it up. And then I think Ironwood's voice actor was asked about it, and he was basically like, I never even heard of that before. Like, I never even heard of it. And it presents these really conflicting like points of view of like, well, what are we supposed to believe? Personally, I lean toward the fact that was just some hand wave to get everyone to kind of look away from how his character did a 180. But if they want to commit to it, have at it. Cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's more glaring on like the bad storytelling that the voice actor didn't even know. Oh, that's why this happened. Okay. That makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's that was bad. I'm gonna admit that's bad. And then Penny dies again. So that
remember how I was talking about how certain characters follow their fairy tales to a T?
Yeah.
Penny's one of them.
Yeah.
So Penny ends up getting hacked with a virus at a certain point in Volume 8. And the virus is so strong and potent that at a certain point she basically turns to RWBY and she's like, because I have to back step a bit. In Volume 7, Penny ended up getting the Maiden Powers. She ended up getting the Maiden Powers, so basically she got hacked with the virus so that way she could come back to Ironwood, and she didn't want to. And at a certain point, she basically turns to RWBY and she's like, bro, you're going to have to kill me. We can't do this anymore. And they finally go like, no, we're not doing that. We're not killing you. That's not happening. We'll figure it out. And eventually the way they figure it out is one of the 4 magical MacGuffins of the series is called the Relic of Creation, which is basically the staff that hosts this genie-like figure inside of it that can basically build anything that you want. But the thing is, it can only build like one thing at a time. So currently, the relic of creation built the floating structure that is Atlas. So the second they use it again, Atlas is just going to come hurtling toward the ground.
I see.
So they go in and they get the relic using Penny, because maidens can open the doors to get the magical MacGuffins of the series, which I'm trying not to get too deep into, just because that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Yeah, makes sense though.
So they end up getting it, and they pop the genie out, and he's like, "Hey, like, what do y'all want?" And basically they go, "Can you make Penny a human body?" And he makes Penny a human body, so Penny becomes human, and her robot body gets destroyed or whatever. And then they use it again to basically then go, okay, we need you to build like these gateways to another kingdom so we can transport every single citizen of Atlas to this other kingdom. And it takes place in like this void realm, basically, where there's only a bunch of pathways and doors that you can walk through or whatever. That ends up getting blown up in their faces, because Cinder comes in and basically kind of starts picking them off one by one, and basically sends them off into the Shadow Realm, where it looks like they're basically ending up at the World Tree, or as I've been calling it since I've seen it, Rock and Jima. That's what I've been calling it. And during that, I think Cinder ends up like piercing Penny in like this really like a bad way that looks like it's going to be fatal. But Jean kind of comes to her side, and Jean, who has the healing semblance of the group, basically goes, "I can heal you." And Penny goes, No, don't heal me. Let me kill me, and let me pass on the maiden powers to someone else, because we can't let Cinder get the maiden powers. That's kind of like the spin, but Jean has the healing semblance, and he's used it to heal much worse injuries in the past. So Jean basically kills Penny. The maiden powers go to Weiss's sister, Winter. And then Penny dies again. And she was only human for about a grand total of an episode.
Yeah.
And this time she's dead for real, because she was human. So
yeah, she's. I'd be very surprised if she comes back, but
they have the door open for that, actually.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised again. But
that's like so interesting, because you can see like in that description, I could see like so many different parts where they're like forced to make tough decisions, and where it could end up like tragically happening. But then it seems like they're just like, so we're gonna kind of take not just the easy way out, but like a weird way out. Like you could see like, you know, they have to sacrifice the city for her, but then like she's getting attacked, so it's like a big tragedy. And then like, but like the fact that they could heal her and she chooses not to seems a bit weird. And so I think I'm understanding and seeing the vision.
Yeah. It can be infuriating. Like I said before, I'm just hanging in there just to see how they end it. I really want to see how they resolve it, because
that makes me wonder, like, because you guys seem like very like fans who are invested, but like very balanced fans. It makes me wonder, how does like the majority of the fan base feel? Is there, because I think it's like a big fan base. Are there very much levels to it of like RWBY fell off, or RWBY was always bad, or RWBY was good but now it's not as good? Or are there some people who are like, no, RWBY is perfect, it has never faltered, it did nothing wrong, kind of thing? Like, where does everyone stand?
RWBY's fan base is incredibly fractured.
Okay.
Incredibly fractured in that regard.
From what I've seen, I could tell you that too. It's like there are the believers that it declined a long time ago. There are the believers that it shouldn't have continued past Volume 2 or Volume 3. You know, there are the people that are saying, hey, you know, it still has its problems, but it's okay. You know, it's getting better and better. And then people that were fans up till Volume 8, and now they're like, fuck this show. So, but I'll let Carter take away in case I missed any.
So RWBY's fan base encompasses a lot of like other shows that are of a very similar vein, like She-Ra, Korra, The Owl House, Amphibia shows the young adult adventure series that you see. There is a very hardcore fan base that looks at it and they're like, this show is amazing because of the amazing representation that we have in here, of the great storytelling, the wonderful fight scenes. There's a clear vision, and I love these people. #Stan Weiss. Then you have the other half of the fan base that's like, the show is absolutely abysmal. It is a train wreck. Why do y'all still like this? And there's there's warring faction between the two of them, the two sides, where it's like that. And it makes discourse around the show very difficult because there's never really a healthy way of discussing it because I think there's a lot of people who are like myself, who are very tied to this series, who very much loved it at a certain point, but are very disappointed with it. And then there are the people that just kind of love it all the way through, and they're like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life.
That is an apt description of the RWBY fan base.
So this is the most peaceful RWBY discussion of all time.
Yeah, actually.
Yes, let's go.
And personally, this is actually encapsulates my hesitation with even wanting to broach RWBY again after, because Shaw brought it up to me, and I was just like, no, I've been purposely avoiding RWBY conversations since like 2016. Like, I don't want to get back into this.
We've talked about Attack on Titan so many times. We have gone to the
No, that's different. That's different. That's not this.
No, but that one's different.
This is close to home. This is in the Western.
I actually think that RWBY discourse is worse than Attack on Titan discourse.
Damn.
Yeah.
That's wild.
See, Attack on Titan discourse takes on a bunch of different forms.
Yeah.
And it's never really centered on like one thing outside of the ending at this point.
Yeah.
But RWBY's discourse is about everything. There is not one thing that is sanctimonious about this entire show.
Nothing is sacred.
Nothing is sacred. Everything is up for debate.
They can find an argument. You can find an argument about almost anything.
Yeah,
RWBY.
because there are the people that hated RWBY from the beginning. Obviously, since Volume 1, they're like, this was ass, it was crap since the beginning. And then a real fraction started when, for context, Shaw, when we were talking earlier about the tonal shift in Volume 3, that was because Monty Oum died in between Volumes 2 and 3. So he died in the early production of Volume 3. He didn't get to finish it. So, and he had his own, I think, vision for Volume 3 that was probably in outline form, but not completely. So the team kind of had to run with like whatever they had, and they kind of went their own way about it. And I remember, I can't cite anything at the moment, like some interview or something with the crew at the time saying that because of Monty's death, they felt, I don't know, they felt like moved or compelled to kind of capture that in that darker tone and dealing with that loss in Volume 3. And that's why they went in that direction. And then also, like on a technical level, with the loss of Monty, and this is also what creates some other fractions and divisions and, controversy in the fandom, is that it lost some of, Monty's signature style of that action, that flashy sequences that only he could kind of do in his way. And the team kind of knew that. So they sort of like, instead of trying to recapture that, and it's understandable to a degree, their choice was more to double down on the storytelling. Because, Monty wasn't really as much about the storytelling. He had the writers handling that, and he had his vision, but he was more about, making the sequences and what he's known for. And they were like, okay, well, we'll just double down on the lore, the world building, and the storytelling. And you really get that like Volume 4 onward trying to do that.
In between Volume 3 and Volume 4 as well, because Monty had died, Monty was working on Maya, I believe. It was the 3D animation program he was using. That was what he was very familiar with. I believe that's what he built Dead Fantasy off of. When he died, most of the team actually wasn't very comfortable with Maya. They had been working on Blender from Red versus Blue. And in between Volume 3 and Volume 4, they switched over to Blender, which is when the show takes a very new art style and a very different look to it, which I personally think was to its detriment. Just because I think that in Volume 3, that's like the crispest. The models looked crisper than they ever had before. The colors completely popped off the screen. And I think that's when they had finally gotten a good feel of how to handle movement and whatnot in there. And once they moved over to Blender, a lot of the color was really lost in the series, and a lot of them got muted. You can take a look at the concept art that was done for the characters and like their designs, and then look at their in-show models, and the colors are very muted, and it's a very noticeable thing because color is such a huge part of the show. So losing that, I think, also lost a bunch of its identity with it as well.
So this is just a very minor correction. So the switch did happen. That all happened, as Carter said, but they switched to Maya. Monty did use some Maya, but his original program that he built everything off of was Poser. That was what he was huge on. And it's not an industry standard software. No one animated in fucking Poser, but Monty did, because he liked to do a lot of mocap. Like he would green screen himself doing a lot of the movements and stuff. So, and he could do that in Poser. And he had this really weird, like idiosyncratic workflow that didn't work for everyone except just him. And it kind of like, from interviews, like sort of frustrated like the crew, because it was just his way of doing things. He was all about efficiency, but standard like animators, people in the industry use Maya, and that's what they know how to do. And he was like, well, I have all these other tools and all this other stuff. I got to do it my way, And that was what made it tough. So as soon as he like died, they like just switched over completely to Maya. And I know this only because I followed Monty closely because I wanted to be an animator at a time. So I was like very focused on that aspect of him. To the point that, embarrassingly enough, I actually asked him in person once if I could be his intern. I gave him my business card. And that was actually at NYCC 2014, which was unfortunately, I think, either his last convention appearance or one of his last convention appearances. And yeah, so that's how I know about that. Like that was the part that anyone that wanted to make their own anime or was inspired by Monty as like his work ethic and as what he did and was able to achieve. That's the part that, besides the awesome flashy action sequences, it's more of what he was able to do at such a young age. So, he inspired us.
I respect the grind, by the way.
Yeah. Love that. Love the hustle. I mean, I was going to force you to bring that up at some point because I know Carter doesn't. I was going to be like, tell him you met him and asked him for a job.
It was like tell him the 2 minutes. Yeah. It was like right after the panel. What's crazy? I actually looked up that con today, to see if there was pictures of the panel, and I found it. And I saw if there was like, oh, is there an audience picture? And I found an audience picture, and I can spot myself all the way in the fucking back. I'm like, that's me. Because I was with my friend, and I could tell that's my friend. I'm like, that's us. Because we got in super late, so we were just in the back.
Oh my God.
And I was like, proof.
It's funny. I actually I had met the voice actors of the series too. So I had very younger Carter, before he ended up getting into the degree of TV and film and whatnot, was thinking about maybe going into journalism and reporting. And back in 2017, when I was really, really big into RWBY, I got tickets to RTX. But I specifically did it in a way because I couldn't go by myself. I had to have my dad go with me. I got press passes, and I did a story on it. So I got to go to like the media panels and whatnot. And I got to meet basically the entire like voice actors and whatnot. All very sweet people, very nice from my brief interactions with them. And it's just that's also like another aspect of the series that I think resonates with a lot of people, is how personable a lot of the people working behind it are and how connected the show feels to the fan base. But I think that's also a double-edged sword, where because it feels so personal, it kind of becomes this thing where it's like the show belongs to us, and it's like, not really. It belongs to Warner Media, and they can do whatever they want with it at this point. So
yeah,
it's true.
It can be a manga, it can be an anime, whatever they want it to be.
It feels like
Justice League.
Yeah, Justice League. What were you gonna say, Shaw?
Oh no, Bryce, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say the main thing, once a big corporation got it, does it make money? That's all it cares about. Yeah. Can you make money out of it? And
that's it.
They'll sacrifice anything in it to make money.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I think I was thinking about it, like when you guys were talking about it, I was trying to think like what is like the main, like describing like the main appeal of RWBY to someone, because like there's kind of we kind of touched on it, like you hear some people call RWBY like ugly, which you would not normally expect for a show that is like an action spectacle. But like, I think we've all discussed like the pros to how it looks and like how like the color is a big visual identifier. I think it's like that mix of like fairy tale, maybe like gothic fairy tale, maybe a bit of steampunk fairy tale, like, you know, like fairy tales kind of aged up for a teenage audience. Like all of that like plays into it. But I think you all touched on a really important note of why I think it resonates with so many people still to this day, is that it's kind of still has that element of like the Monty, what I describe as like Monty Oum's like signature thing, which is like, this is a guy who made the thing on his computer by himself. And it's kind of scaled up a bit. It's not full-fledged, you know, big media production, but it still has that personal feel where you're like, oh, I can tell like like some people just thought this was cool and they worked on it. And so it does have that personable feel that I think a lot of anime fans have too, where they're like, this is my thing. Not everyone knows about it, but just enough people know about it. And we all have this like really deep connection to it. And I feel like RWBY really carries that well, where you have that personable, like accessible feeling with it that doesn't feel like super corporate, super polished, but it still has that heart and soul that a lot of people connect with.
RWBY, I like to think of as like sort of a time capsule of a specific period. One of the things that I've always said about RWBY is RWBY wears its inspiration on its sleeve, and its inspiration was Toonami from the years of 2007 to 2011. So whatever you could find on Toonami, it's in RWBY.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of its inspiration from like Gurren Lagann, Cowboy Bebop, Bleach, Naruto. There's a lot of inspiration in there, and I think it comes from a time period when anime wasn't really in the mainstream as much, when it was still this very like indie, very like, I gotta go torrent this online if I want to go see it. Which VHS tape does has new episodes on? And there's a lot of that like passion and heart that a lot of anime fans had that was put into it. You know, I described Dead Fantasy as JRPG anime Fantasia, and that's what RWBY kind of wanted to be as well. And I think that's a really cool idea for a show, because we always talk about, you know, every season or so, there's some show that comes around that looks just magnificent, that looks beautiful, and it's all about the spectacle, but we never see, but there's always like something that's like maybe holding it back. And I think with RWBY, you could kind of forgive it because it was this very indie production, and you don't grade it as harshly as, you know, whatever Studio Mappa or Studio Wit is doing, you know? So you feel a lot of that passion just kind of seep through, and it's hard to not feel contagious and like get that and be like, yeah, this is really cool, you know?
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially with its Dead Fantasy roots, because again, like that's a good point. Like, you know, I feel like that's essentially the biggest issue with Dead Fantasy. As much as we'd want to, you know, see it be official, is it's the licensing hell. You know, bringing that thing to life.
The only way that's gonna work, you have to get Sakurai to do it. The man is he's the only one who could.
Yes.
The only way.
Yeah.
He would fend. He would do it for us.
Yeah. So the logical step for someone like Monty that likes that kind of crossover and bringing those worlds together was to make an original IP that could possibly recreate that. So I did like the way you put that, Carter, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean, you could not make money on Dead Fantasy as much as we would like, but I love it. Goat.
It's great. It's great. You know, like that's just the thing that it's, I think we all like look for a series that, you know, you can clearly see the passion and love put into it. We all like to talk about our favorites and be like, yeah, I was inspired by like this, and this. And you can totally see it if you like go back and like read all of the things that inspired it. And sometimes it doesn't like come through as apparently. But with RWBY, you can like immediately pick up on the cues. You know, all of the Grim designs remind me of like hollows from Bleach, or the forgetting what they were called in Soul Eater. They remind me of that.
Oh yeah, that thing. Yeah.
The even the first scene in the show itself with RWBY in the in From Dusk Till Dawn, the dust shop. That's an homage to the Cowboy Bebop movie, the opening scene in that.
Yep.
You see it all over the series, and it's a wonderful thing to kind of like see. And even as they're still making it, when you start seeing the things that they start taking more inspiration from, and you start seeing that seep in a little bit, it's contagious. It's like, it is just, it's fun. It's fun picking out those Easter eggs.
I mean, I was watching some RWBY stuff today to just refresh. I was watching like just volume 8 fight scenes just to see how the fight scenes now stack up against like, you know, back then, and see if it got better or whatever. And I was seeing the fight with that you guys were talking about with Penny and versus Cinder or whatever, and like she pulls out all the blades, and I totally remembered that like Monty just ripped off like like he took essentially New or V13's fight like combat style from Blaze Blue back in the day, and that was actually taken from Dead Fantasy
yes.
Volume 8 with the preview with Nominee. And I remember when I think it was Bryce that showed me that, we were just like, oh my god, you know, like it was just so awesome as a fan. Like he just literally just used that combat system, and he would just do things like that. But and it's interesting too that when I was reading about the program he used, Poser, that the other reason why he liked to use that program is that he could essentially have a library where he could reuse all of the things that he's built and all of the fight scenes and all the characters and models, and just sort of keep reusing them. They're already there, ready to go, and that would make his process more efficient. So he would do that all the time, and he would just switch up the camera work so it would look different. And that's kind of the advantage. So he was actually reusing stuff from Dead Fantasy just in the early RWBY seasons.
Yeah, no, man was ingenuitive. He knew how to work his programs to the limit, and just full respect to that, you know, especially when you're basically a one-man team, like to be able to do that and pump out high quality content like that well animated, insane, crazy, especially for the time period.
Yeah. I do have to say though, it is easier, not super easy, but like to get away with stunning action choreography than something as mundane as a walk cycle. So that's why the first volume of RWBY has some weird ass walk cycles.
I love the running cycle that they use, because it's the running cycle that you see Tifa use in Dead Fantasy when she's running on top of the train. And it's running on top of the train, and it's really funny because it totally does not look natural in the setting of Inhabitant in RWBY. But every time I see it, I get a little smile on my face because I think about that, because that's probably my favorite episode of Dead Fantasy.
Yeah, that one's like, I was rewatching Dead Fantasy at work because it's on YouTube, so I can just kind of rewatch it. And it was wild because 5, you know, it's all like a cool like spectacle and stuff, but there's like actual like visual storytelling and stuff that is so intriguing that makes me think about it and like, you know, yearn for another season. But like, I don't know, I get so like nostalgic for that for so many levels. If we get the Onimaru okay to talk about Dead Fantasy now, if we just get
you guys have
at it.
Go for it.
Okay, so I have a weird connection to Dead Fantasy because I played Dead or Alive a lot as a kid in Sears when my mom was looking at appliances and they had Dead or Alive 3 on the Xbox. So I would play that. And then by the time Xbox 360 came out, they came out with like Dead or Alive 4, which was like one of the flagship games and it had like stunning visuals for the time. And I'm like 13 and I remember playing it as a kid. So I got that and I finished it and it was like pretty, actually, like it looked great. The fighting was great, but like it had a kind of good story if you're 13 and like they played an emotional song for the credit. So I was like crying over this like fighting game that mostly people know for the beach volleyball spinoff. Very embarrassing. It was such a like period. So like I really can never like criticize fan service too much as a Dead or Alive fan, because that's like the main selling point of the franchise. But I have this very weird emotional connection to it. So fast forward to whenever Dead Fantasy comes out, like most people I think were connected to it for the Final Fantasy aspect for understandable reasons because it's the much bigger franchise. But I knew about all the Final Fantasy stuff, but I had actually like played Dead or Alive. So I'm like, oh wait, like I know all of these references. And I remember in like the first episode, it was like I saw one of like the signature moves that like I would do. I'm like, okay, that's like, you can do that in the game. That's really impressive. And like, it just kind of moved from there as like it kept expanding. So, I mean, I think it's just so cool to see like two different types of fighting combat games put together, and you kind of, it's that cool idea that you get for like crossover series where you're like, okay, who would win if we have this scenario, this power is allowed, like they're allowed to do all of this, what would happen? And it's just kind of like the thought process of like, how would these really cool fights play out? And like, you don't even really get a winner sometimes. Like some things always kind of interrupt them, which makes it interesting, I think. But just like the thought process and seeing how it plays out from someone who obviously cared about both franchises, could really like animate them and like bring them to life in an interesting way, is like peak internet for me. It's like the coolest product that you could only see on the internet.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have to agree. I mean, like you said, my exposure to it was through Final Fantasy, specifically through 7, because I was a diehard Final Fantasy 7 fan. I have memories of going to my uncle's house and seeing his PS1 there and basically beating Final Fantasy 7 over the course of like 3 years. And you know, Final Fantasy 7 shaped so much of like my media taste in general. Mm-hmm. It's like that and like Batman, like that, like shaped just that. Right? So, you know, I was a huge fan of Cloud and I loved Tifa because I thought it was really cool that that in this world where everyone had like guns and like swords, she was just punching things. That's cool. Yeah. That's just cool to me. So obviously when I saw her in like Dead Fantasy for the first time, I was like, oh my God, like it's Tifa. I know her. And it was really cool because, you know, I think at this time, I don't know if Dissidia had really like hit the West yet, but the only time you'd really gotten to see Tifa like actually like fight was Advent Children. And that was the only time you really got to see it because, you know, obviously 7 was built at the very beginning of the PS1 and has aged like cheese. And you never got to see her like really, really fight. And this was the first time you really got to see it. And it was as cool as everyone imagined it as. And, you know, just to also keep it like full circle, when I saw Yang, it was very clear that she was Tifa inspired. And, you know, when I was going and rewatching like Dead Fantasy, like now, and I was seeing all the Tifa fight scenes and I was seeing just how they were like choreographed and the moves she was doing, I was like, this is like so Yang. This is exactly who Yang is when she fights. And it's great. Like, and there were just so many like things that he did in Dead Fantasy that just made it really special. It just made it really, really work.
Yeah. There were scenes where he incorporated like things from the different games like Materia, how like Tifa was losing Materia in her fight. I was like, oh wow, that's because when I watched Dead Fantasy originally, I'm just like, okay, so these are Dead or Alive characters versus Final Fantasy characters. I'm like, well, there should be no way that a Dead or Alive character should beat a Final Fantasy character. It's like, okay, what's going on here? And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then you get into more of the lore of Dead or Alive, like, oh wait, the ninjas, they can do some stuff. Like Hayabusa's legit. Like he'll kill people. And like you got Ayane, of course. So I was like, okay, this is getting really interesting. And then, you know, he threw in some Kingdom Hearts. I'm like, Kairi? Like Kairi just got a Keyblade, a couple of years ago in canon.
Can we
say that Monty gave her a Keyblade first before Nomura gave her a Keyblade?
I was gonna say that I feel like Kairi and like Dead Fantasy is kind of like better than Kairi.
I mean, I don't even think that's a hot take. I think
I'm glad.
That's not even far off. She has done nothing.
Yeah.
My favorite thing about Dead Fantasy Kairi is that in the teaser for episode 8, when she takes off her clothes and the dress drops and it's clearly Namine's dress, and then when she starts actually doing stuff, her hair turns yellow and she basically turns into Namine.
Yeah.
That hit a little bit different. That hit a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's like a great point. Like, because as much as it's like the fan service game, like Dead or Alive does have those like lore to it that you just, because like they're up to like 6 now. They got to do something. So like it's interesting, and you get something like episode 4 where it's like Kasumi is fighting Yuna. And then all of a sudden, all of like the Kasumi clones show up, and she looks conflicted, and she's not actually fighting Yuna. Like I got that completely because she like she's always trying to like stop her clones. Like she has no control over her clones. Like she's trying to fight them herself. So like seeing like something be like so emotionally conflicting in that moment, and then seeing like Yuna take them down for a bit and struggle, and then like Cloud shows up, like just so cool. But then like Kasumi's like later takes them away and takes them, you know, teleports them somewhere to take them down herself. Like it's such an interesting way of staying true to both sides while also showing like, you know, whatever conflict is going on, like we don't know, but it's like they all have their sides, but no one's really good or bad. Like you see the different levels of like morality that they're having their individual fight, proving themselves or whatever. And when people start interfering, they're like, nah, that's not cool. Like you're going too far. Like we're not actually trying to do anything too harmful. Like there's just like a specific reason we're engaging in this, which is left up to interpretation, but it's interesting.
There are very specific cues in the way that the people are animated too that really show it as well. One of the things that I love about it is how they show the teamwork between everyone. Like people are like jumping off of each other. They're helping everyone up. Like they're moving and they're like, they feel like a collective unit. And that's one of those things that also carried over to early RWBY that I absolutely loved, where, you know, they're basically group mob rushes. And like, that's what I loved, because so many series are about like the one-on-one and like getting that emotional connection there. But there's something to be said about just watching 4 people just beat the hell out of someone. Like it's kind of great.
During that whole thing, there were scenes in Dead Fantasy. I'm just like, you just got hit with an axe through a building. Wait, you can't get up from that. Okay, you're just gonna get up and keep going. I was like, all right. I used to think it was gonna get really serious because they started before Dead Fantasy stopped. They were starting to bring in some of the male characters in there. I was like, okay, well, if things were real before, I mean, you put Hayabusa, Hayato in there, and then you could Cloud. Vincent was coming. I'm like,
oh shit.
Yeah, no, it was gonna get really wild.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it was gonna get really nuts. And I'm more than positive that Sephiroth was gonna show up at some point, because
you gotta have
Cloud is there. Sephiroth is always there.
He'll never be a memory. He'll never be a memory.
I think the biggest visual cue of Sephiroth showing up was, 1, all of the feathers that kept on appearing before people. And 2, at the end of episode 2, when Renoa shows up, she's one-winged angel, like to the max, descending from the sky, like, and everything. And I remember when Cloud first showed up, my first thought was like, oh my god, he's going to do the Omni Slash. He's going to do the Omni Slash on someone, and somebody's going to die. And then after that, my next thought was, where is Sephiroth? Because like you said, if Cloud is there, Sephiroth is not far behind. Yeah, exactly. No matter where you are.
He followed him to Super Smash Brothers.
I was about to say that. It's so insane to think, like, we're talking about this like back in the day, like crossovers you wouldn't believe, and now like we have them in Super Smash Brothers. It's crazy.
Each episode was like a Super Smash Bros. Reveal, where you're like, who's going to show up next? And then they just add this, and you're like, we're just going to keep going, and then it just keeps getting more and more hype.
And the only person who can get it done, who can bring back Dead Fantasy, is going to be Sakurai. I'm telling you, he's the only one.
Yeah.
I did hear, I don't know the details on this, but I read earlier that there was a Dead Fantasy remake like last year by someone. Is that?
I saw that on YouTube, right? The guy is just like remaking it in like a higher.
Yeah,
I think is that what it was? Just a remaster? Okay, because they had it labeled as remake, so I wasn't sure what it was.
Yeah.
Remaster. Okay.
Especially how strict the IP laws are right now. I don't think actually remake it and not like get sued into oblivion. Or copyright stricken into oblivion.
I mean, now that RWBY's an IP, maybe they'll make a Dead Fantasy style crossover for RWBY and something else. RWBY and, like you said, Justice League, but this time a fight. RWBY / Injustice.
Well, I mean, the RWBY characters have been appearing in Blaze Blue cross tag.
Oh, okay. That's right. Mm-hmm. And haven't they also been in like some gacha games too? No?
They were in like a couple of like really like nondescript ones, and then they had their own little gacha Castle Crashers game called Amity Arena, which I think shut down like about a year ago. But you know, the big thing with RWBY now is, there's very clearly a push to try and put it in more stuff now. So, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the one big thing that I think a lot of people thought we'd get at some point was a fighting game, just because with Arxis like attached to stuff, we kind of figured, oh, that's the next logical step. Yeah. I think the only big issue is I don't know how well a RWBY fighting game would sell. Like, I've seen Arxis make a lot of fighting games. I've seen them make a lot. And their fighting games based off of like IPs or whatnot usually have a big enough IP that they can like sell maybe like 1 million, 2 million copies based off of like their IP alone. Like the Ultimax series, I think Grand Blue was even pretty popular, and then they're making DNF, which I know is like a hugely popular game in like Korea, I think. So they're able to push those IPs and sell those units. I don't know how well a RWBY fighting game would sell, but I know when Arxis had announced they were like producing a RWBY related game, everyone was like, oh, like it's going to be a fighting game. It's going to be great. I honestly thought it was going to be along the lines of like Kill la Kill If, where it was just like, we're producing it, but like some other team is just handling the rest. It's instead a Metroidvania that's releasing later this year. That's also canon to the series in between Volume 7 and Volume 8, or in between Volume 7 at some point. So there's clearly a push to want to have it in more stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if, honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if, whenever NetherRealm gets around to making Injustice 3, if they maybe push that into, push one of those characters into there as just like a DLC character. Because I mean, they've done like Hellboy, they've done Mortal Kombat characters, they did the Ninja Turtles, which gave us an amazing reaction image that I love every single time I see that video. But dude, I could be gaming. I love that video. But yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting to see like RWBY go from like this like indie project to like, this is an IP now. You're going to see it everywhere and you're going to like it.
Yeah. RWBY's I guess in the mainstream now. More or less. Yeah.
It's big enough that I think it's gotten like, I know it's gotten like a New York Comic Con panel.
Yeah, definitely.
It's gotten like a big New York Comic Con panel before. I know they've done stuff at San Diego Comic Con as well with it. I know it was like all over like the promotional material, I think for like 2019 San Diego Comic Con. It's one of those series where I think at this point it's become I think it's just by osmosis at this point become just part of our like general understanding of anime as a medium and just as a whole. So it's interesting. It's like really interesting seeing it as like this sort of like subsection of everything and like what it ended up inspiring and whatnot.
So with that, personal question for you guys.
Yeah.
Do you consider RWBY an anime? I have to ask this. Have you thought it's always been an anime? Or is it only now an anime now that it's getting an adaptation?
I've personally never thought of RWBY as an anime. It has anime elements, but I've never thought of it as an anime because anime really, depending on the genre of anime, it really sticks close to its tropes. Like it really holds on. And RWBY for me is like, so I don't think it's like that. And it's just it just does its own thing in its own way, sometimes to its detriment. So for me, I never felt that it was an anime, but it is anime-esque. Like when people not complain, but when the big argument about Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra, oh, it's an American anime. Well, yeah, I mean, you can say that. I mean, but it's still its own thing in its own way because it does have tropes, but I would say like it's more like a novel. If you go to like the Avatar and everything, like, oh, you're the chosen one, you have to fix this, everything like that. So I would say RWBY's just it's an American show with anime-esque themes for me.
I look at RWBY as much. I think RWBY's as much of an anime as like Cannon Busters, Neo Yokio, and like Steven Universe are anime. Like it very clearly has its inspiration there. It very clearly knows it wants to be an anime, but I think the only part of it that is an anime is Ice Queendom, because it's very clearly made by like a Japanese team with a Japanese focus.
Yeah.
And RWBY's story structure, I've always felt, and ideas have always followed a more Western ideology rather than an Eastern one. Because, you know, I think that, you know, at the core of a lot of stories is always like overcoming, you know, personal like strife and whatnot. But the way that the two sides of the world do it very differently. And I think that the way that I see Japan usually do it is you overcome something, but at a cost. There's always a cost to overcoming something. But I think in more Western related media, it's usually like you overcome it and you do it, and it's about the journey of how you overcome it. And RWBY very much follows it's about the journey, rather than like what are you giving up for it, you know. So that's really where I kind of draw the line at. I know that with how media at this point has just become such a global thing, and how we're experiencing stories from all different walks of life, the phrase anime at a certain point is probably just gonna go by the wayside a little bit at a certain point, because it's just gonna become just another cartoon. We're already getting to that point in time where it's just becoming part of our media diet. So I don't really look at main RWBY as an anime. Ice Queendom obviously is one, very clearly is one, and I think that it's going to be a very different kind of story than what main RWBY is going to be.
Yeah. And I think we've gotten to a point now, like back in the day, I think when you say like, yo, this thing isn't an anime, people kind of take it as an insult, because they're like, oh, you're calling it a cartoon. You're saying like, it's not as serious. You're saying it's not as good as anime. And I think we're all kind of in the similar boat where like, we're not talking about cartoon versus anime in terms of one is better than the other. It's more of like the classification in terms of like who is making it, where it's coming from. And then, as you said, like Eastern versus Western styles of storytelling. And I think that's a really great distinction to make for the people who do take it as like calling something a cartoon is an insult, when like, you know, none of us on an anime podcast consider calling something a cartoon an insult, since here we are.
Young Justice is great.
Young Justice was great till season 2. I don't know about season 3.
Arcane is the best anime produced in the past 10 years. I'm just saying. Like,
so good. No, but definitely it's not to gatekeep, as you know. That's why people would get offended in the past with calling RWBY, you know, not an anime, because it's the whole like gatekeeping notion. But really, it's like Shaw was saying, it's a classification. It is definitely anime inspired, but sooner or later, none of that's going to matter anyway, you know, because again, it's all going to be like, oh, where was this produced? You know, this country, that country, and that's kind of it. But that's kind of all we got. Did you guys want to add anything else about, you know, RWBY or Dead Fantasy or anything that we didn't really cover?
Hopefully the next volume comes out soon.
It has been more than a year, right?
Yeah, but you know, I partly blame that on the COVID times, but I know that slowed down production. But hopefully it comes out soon so I can see where they're taking the story and whether or not this volume breaks me. I'm like, all right, I'm out.
It's funny because, you know, I think this volume is very clearly a make or break for the series, I think, for a lot of people, because they've done something very interesting where they've isolated about 6 of the characters on an island, and now you're kind of forced to give them character development because they're the only 6 people there. You're kind of forced to do that. And one of the big criticisms with the show as well has always been the production times, because there's always been an incredibly quick turnaround. Like, a season will start in November, end in February. They'll make an announcement for the next season with a trailer for the next season in July, and then have the next season ready in November as well. Like, there is an incredibly quick turnaround, and I can't imagine that production cycle helps the show and its script in any way, shape, or form. Now, however, they've basically given themselves 2 years to work on this. It is going to be about a 2-year wait since the last volume. And I think that's going to be telling of what the final product is going to be like for the show. Because
Yeah.
the one thing I can say too, you one thing we've kind of talked about this entire time is we're here to see how it ends.
Mhm.
Bryce, let me ask you a question.
Mhm.
How do you think RWBY's going to end? Because I have no clue what this series is.
Oh my goodness, there's so many plot lines they have because the characters are set up to be like they're almost a little bit like their fairy tale characters. So Jean is Joan of Arc. So if it goes by that, he's supposed to be burnt alive. And then, I mean, the main thing I would say is that it's either going to be RWBY defeats Salem, like not Team RWBY. I think it's going to be RWBY herself because they were kind of angling that at Volume 8 that at the end it's going to be somehow RWBY has to overcome this huge mountain that no one else has been able to overcome. And RWBY's not going to find a way to kill Salem. Because RWBY seems more or less like the type of person who wants to help people once she knows their circumstances. So, like, Salem is probably going to be one of those people that she tries to, like, help out once she knows more about her, I think. I think the only person she cannot forgive is Cinder. I think. So I think it's going to end with, I think it's going to be a happy ending with a bunch of other people who died.
I kind of look at it as like it's going to be like Naruto and Nagato. At a certain point, like you got that really big like fight scene that's going to be like super spectacle heavy, and a bunch of people are going to die, and RWBY and Salem are going to talk it out, and Salem's going to kind of be like, all right, you win, I concede, you got it, and then Cinder's probably going to come in and be like, nope, and then torch the place. They got to fight at some point. I do agree that I think it's probably going to be a happy ending, just because I don't think this show really has the balls to kill off one of its main characters at the end. I don't think so. Because
I mean, if they do, they lose one of the letters in the title.
They do.
Not RWBY anymore.
Like, because I mean, I think that there would just be a general riot from within the fan base that they would kill off one of the main characters. I'd personally like to see it. Not because I hate any of them, just because.
I mean, unless they do it heroically, it would have to be some sort of sacrifice. It'd have to be.
RWBY sacrifices herself.
I don't know about that.
I mean,
probably not.
I'd like to see that just because I think it would kind of fit with the parallels of Summer, but like it would give like a different sort of like distinction to it. Give it a different meaning. Because I think there could be something really. I think there could be a really genuine and cool idea behind RWBY dying and basically being like, I leave the world in your hands. I leave the world in your hands. I leave the world in your hands. Rebuild, regrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of other things, I wanted to say, just to anyone who's listening, who's saw Ice Queendom and is basically like, oh boy, I really want to check out RWBY now because now it has its own anime. I'm going to just warn you ahead of time. Anything that's in Ice Queendom is probably not what you're going to see in the main show. It is going to be two totally different experiences. And I think that works to its benefit and it works to its detriment because, again, going into this, I wasn't sure who this was going to be appealing to, especially after that first trailer when they just showed a bunch of redone stuff from the first 2 volumes, which really kind of disappointed me. But I think that if you're a new fan who wants to get into the series, go for it. Have fun. Keep in mind some of the things that we might have talked about. I trust all of you. You guys have reasonable heads. But I also do think it's worth checking out Ice Queendom when it does come out, just because I think that it is going to be a very different thing. And I think it's going to be very interesting to compare and contrast the two and kind of see like what an actual like industry professional writer's take on RWBY is, because Miles and Carrie are not industry professionals. I forgot who the writer is for Ice Queendom. I know it's the guy that did Psycho-Pass season 2, which kind of scary right off the bat. But but I think it's gonna be interesting. I think it's gonna be a very interesting take, and I hope that people would be willing to give both a chance and kind of see where it leads them.
So after everything, after all the disappointment, you guys would still lean towards, telling people that haven't watched RWBY is still worth checking out with the asterisks, with the caveats, but you still generally like RWBY for the world building and for the lore and for, the potential that it has. And you think it's still worth checking out.
Yeah. I would just say to quote Scar from The Lion King, be prepared.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard for me still to not recommend it to people because it was such an impactful show for me. If I hadn't watched it, probably wouldn't be here talking with you guys. And I just think that I think there's something there. I think it's worth seeing the creative idea of someone like Monty kind of play out, because if you're someone like me who's always looking out for kind of like up and coming creators, and you're trying to pick out like the indie stuff because you think the bigger corporations and whatnot aren't giving you the stories that you really want to see, going back and looking at like Monty's work and seeing what he was doing at the time and understanding the importance and the impact that it had, I think it's just super important and just a great experience for anyone, especially, for people who are animation buffs who just want to see something just really cool that they might not have seen before.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, definitely.
That's well said. And we've loved having you guys on. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for chatting with us about RWBY, informing us of all the stuff we've been missing out and aren't up to date on. So it's good. It's good to kind of get the lay of the land as to where RWBY is now, where the fan base is, and all of that. Yeah. And besides that, if you want to check out our friend Carter here, he has his Twitter, which is at what is it, Carter?
It's Carter _G. I think that's
okay.
The handle.
Yeah, you could follow him, interact with him there. And as for Bryce, he's exclusive to the Just Weebs podcast, so we will remain. We'll keep him for whenever we want to bring him back on, and Carter as well is welcome too. But with that, we're gonna head off, guys. Thank you so much for listening to the episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see all four of us back on for another pod, either related to RWBY or Dead Fantasy, let us know in the comments. And that might happen. And if you haven't subscribed already, help the channel grow by subscribing. And that's it. Those are our opinions on RWBY. I think we had a very balanced, fair conversation, which is, I was afraid we were not going to have, because that's why I've been avoiding RWBY, but it was there. It exists. So, and if you don't agree with it and you have more extreme conversations, well, fuck you. I don't want to know. Because after all, what do we know? We only know what we know. We're Just Weebs.